The form said Supplemental Observer. That was the misfiling. I didn't know it at the time. I just handed the form to the intake attendant, a young Vel Sorvani with pale gill slits who read it twice, tilted his head at something I couldn't see, and directed me down a corridor I hadn't been shown on the orientation map. The door at the end said, Intake Classification Annex in 3 scripts. Below that, in smaller characters, it said something I later had translated as, All knowledge carried by incoming personnel is subject to full catalog registration. Duration, approximately 40 minutes. I checked my pack. 7 field notebooks, a portable stellar cartography rig the size of a thick paperback, and a personal drive I hadn't bothered to catalog myself because I'd been adding to it continuously for 11 years. I figured 40 minutes was generous. The room inside was beautiful in the way that old libraries are beautiful. Not warm, exactly, but organized in a way that felt like intention. The walls held data columns, narrow shafts of slow-moving light, each one a different color, each one representing what I'd later learn was an ongoing classification thread. At the far end sat a single terminal, and, beside it, a low console where a Keth Sorvani I'd come to know as Intake Warden Preth Ossavel was adjusting something with 2 of his 4 hands. His ridge crests, the bioluminescent band that runs from his temples to the back of his skull, were a calm, steady amber. The color of routine. Supplemental Observer, he said, reading from his own version of my form. 11 years, Outer Survey Division, non-accredited field postings. You carry original documentation? I set the notebooks on the intake shelf, then the drive. He looked at the drive for a moment. This is your personal archive? Field records, observations, measurements, notation logs, everything from the 11 years. Unindexed? Partially. I index in transit. The last 2 years are raw. His ridge crests didn't change color. He slid the first notebook under the catalog reader and said, The Solvereign system will process your materials. 40 minutes, as stated. You may sit. I sat. The Solvereign intake catalog was, I learned afterward, 340 years old. It had been built by the founding consortium of the Dreneth Cataloging Institute to do one specific thing: receive, classify, and archive every piece of knowledge carried by every incoming student, faculty member, and exchange attendee who passed through the annex. It had processed 14,000 individuals. It had never, not once, not even with the bulk knowledge imports of the Veth Sorvani archivists who arrived carrying institutional libraries, filed an incomplete classification. It started on Notebook 1. For the first 10 minutes, nothing unusual happened. The data columns on the walls cycled through their normal sequence. Preth Ossavel made notations at his console. I watched the light and thought about the cartography department, which was where I was actually supposed to be. Then one of the data columns slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. The light in it went from a quick, cycling flicker to something more deliberate, like a finger tracing a line in sand. Preth Ossavel noticed. His ridge crests shifted, amber, to a pale blue-green, which I'd later learn meant something like recalculating. He crossed to the terminal, read something, made a notation, returned to his console. The column kept its slower pace and then, very quietly, a second column slowed to match it. By the time the catalog finished Notebook 1 and moved to Notebook 2, 4 columns had decelerated and 1 had stopped entirely. A small indicator near the ceiling, red-orange, I hadn't noticed it before, was now lit. Preth Ossavel was no longer making notations. He was reading. The catalog is generating cross-reference requests, he said, not quite to me. Against the approved Stellar Reference Archive. Is that unusual? His ridge crest cycled to a deeper blue. It cross-references against the archive when it encounters entries it cannot classify using its existing taxonomy. It finds an entry in your material, looks for a matching designation in the approved record, and if it finds one, classifies accordingly. He paused. It is requesting matches for entries for which it has no designation. How many? He checked. Currently 19. I thought about the first notebook. It covered 14 months of survey work in the Keth Sorvani outer belt. Unmapped as of my arrival, unmapped as of my departure, unmapped as far as anyone at the Institute knew, because no survey team had been cleared to operate there in the 20 years prior. I had gone out there alone, with a portable rig and a lot of patience, and I had come back with measurements for 412 stellar objects the Institute's approved archive had no record of, because no one had been out there to record them. The notebook was not a summary, it was the record. Every measurement taken in the field, by hand, cross-checked twice before I wrote it down. "Those 19, I said, are they stellar designations?" "Yes." "Then the archive won't find matches. Those are original observations. The objects don't have designations yet. I was going to submit the notebooks to the cartography department for formal registration." Preth Ossavel's ridge crests went still. Not dark, still. A color I hadn't seen yet. Somewhere between the pale blue-green and something cooler, more considered. He looked at the drive on the intake shelf. "The drive contains 11 years of similar material? Some of it's been registered, maybe a third. The rest is pending submission or working notes." He did not say anything. He returned to his terminal and input something at length. The stopped column resumed moving, but slower than before, like it had given up trying to run and settled into a walk. By the second hour, 8 columns had slowed and 3 had stopped. The red-orange indicator near the ceiling had been joined by 2 others. Preth Ossavel had been joined by a second technician, a Vel Sorvani woman whose ridge crests ran a continuous alarmed violet I didn't need a translation for. They were not talking to me. They were talking to each other in low tones, and to the catalog in input bursts that I couldn't read from where I was sitting. I pulled Notebook 3 from the shelf, it hadn't been processed yet, and started reviewing my own notes. There was good material in here. 14 months on a tidally locked ice shelf in the Vareth system, cataloging microthermal gradients in the shadow-side geologic layers. Nothing the Academy had touched. Nothing anyone had touched. The catalog took Notebook 3 in the 3rd hour, and all 5 remaining columns slowed to matching pace within 20 minutes. At the start of the 4th hour, the system did something neither technician had apparently ever seen it do. It filed an interim report. Not a completion, an interim. A flag that said, in the translation I got later, "Classification ongoing. Archive cross-reference capacity reached. Generating extension request to primary reference database." The extension request, Preth Ossavel told me carefully, was a formal query asking the Institute's primary stellar archive to expand its taxonomic range to accommodate new designations. The catalog had sent this request because it had run out of existing categories in which to file my entries. It had not run out of my entries. "How many remain unclassified?" I asked. He checked. "As of this moment, 207 entries across all processed notebooks. The drive has not been read." I looked at the drive on the shelf. The drive has approximately 11 years of fieldwork. The notebooks are the organized summary, what I considered worth keeping in bound form. The drive has the raw observation logs beneath them, the measurement data sets, the working notation files, the discarded drafts I kept anyway because sometimes the thing you throw out is the thing you need later. It's considerably larger than the notebooks. His ridge crests went to a color I had no translation for. A deep, settled, somewhat luminous gray-blue that I would only later find out was a Keth Sorvani expression, reserved for moments when the mind encounters a category it did not previously hold space for. He was quiet for a long time. "The catalog," he said finally, "has not filed an incomplete classification in 340 years. I know, you mentioned that. It will need to." "That's all right?" He looked at the notebooks stacked neatly on the return shelf, the ones the system had finished reading, the ones now waiting for a database that didn't yet have room for them. He looked at the drive. Then he picked up his stylus and began writing, by hand, on a physical form. "I am initiating a formal submission pathway to the Institute Cartography Department," he said, "for priority intake of original observational materials." He wrote for a moment. "This is not a standard intake process." "I know. The Cartography Department will need to designate your materials before the catalog can complete your classification. Then I should probably go talk to them." He handed me the form. His ridge crests were the deep gray-blue still, that unnamed color, settled and certain. The color, I think, of a man recalibrating what he thought he knew about what could walk through an intake door. I picked up my notebooks and my drive. The data columns on the walls were still moving, slow and deliberate, working through the extension requests the catalog had generated. "The 40-minute estimate," I said. At the door. Yes, he said. You may want to revise that. He was already writing,